I want to do a little video on something that a number of people pointed me to on Twitter. Anthony Bradley. I didn't know much about him. I just did a little research on him. Why are young guys into Jordan Peterson? It's not his politics, so if you think that's it, take a seat. It's a good point, given all the punditry going on about him. Here's really why. Really? Okay, I'll listen. Baby boomers and Gen X religious leaders have been exegeting the world of men. Here's really why. Baby boomers and Gen X religious leaders have been exegeting the world of men since the early 1990s. Dead wrong, and they've lost a generation of guys in the process. Before Peterson, the first Jungian psychologist to sound the alarm about our culture's disintegrating understanding of masculinity in the late 1980s and early 1990s was Robert Elmore. Peterson is not that different from Moore. So, of course, I clicked on Moore's Amazon link, and well, this is interesting. So, yeah, it looks very Jungian. I had never read him. King, warrior, magician, lover, discovering the archetypes of mature masculinity, the king within, addressing the king in the male psyche, archetypes of initiation, Jung's challenge to contemporary religion. So I'd never heard anything about Robert Moore. So in that sense, Bradley is right. Moore hit the nail on the head with the 1991 King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, rediscovering the archetypes of mature masculinity. Other books come out, like Sam Keen, by like Fire in the Belly. Were evangelicals reading these books? Not really. I had never heard of any of these books. So good point. And part of the reason that I've made the point before that Jung is, evangelicals are scared of Jung, and I can understand why. He's a scary guy. So got to take a look at him. During the 1990s, evangelicals were in part too busy fighting their stupid culture war against liberals with their idolatrous conflation of America and Christianity as they were being played by Republicans. Catholics were all over this. And so apparently Patrick Arnold, never heard of him either, Wild Men, Warriors, and Kings, Masculine Spirituality in the Bible. Now, I think Bradley has a point here that, yeah, in the 80s and 90s, the evangelicals have been fighting their culture war. But again, I think the culture war is a war of two civil religions. And so no question that men were getting lost in the shuffle. All of the attention for a good long time in the evangelical world has been on sexuality and femininity and not masculinity. Why weren't the evangelical leaders reading Jungians? Well, I think there's a reason for that. Maybe because their really silly aversion to the social sciences. I think that could be part of it. But plenty of, I picked up a book by Larry Crabb. Oh, where's the darn thing? A friend of mine, via this whole new project, noted The Silence of Adam, and I haven't had a chance to look at it, but becoming men of courage in a world of chaos. It's certainly, Larry Crabb is not afraid of social sciences, and Larry Crabb is a pretty solid evangelical, and he's been writing books that evangelicals have wanted to read for a while. So so the friend who pointed this to me, who's a pastor in Canada, said, he looked through this book and he thought this looked Petersonian all over the place. Many Catholics listened. Yeah, I think the Catholics have been quite a bit more open to a lot of this. But wait, not so fast. Evangelicals knew something was amiss, and Promise Keepers launched in the 1990s, but it was not based on Jungian observations about American masculinity, so it went off on a tangent and built a biblical masculinity for men needing accountability, etc. Yeah, and because in the 90s there was the evangelical masculinity, and Bradley's going to get into this a little bit. Here's what the Promise Keepers movement missed. Beginning in the 1990s, American culture shifted to a disposition towards men grounded in shame and emasculation. Promise Keepers in part operated in the pre-1950s vision that men's basic problems were self-aggrandizing pride and sexual sin. I think he's got a point. I think Bradley has a point there. I think he's got a lot of points on this, quite frankly. I wish it were more fleshed out. Oops, the Jungians knew better. Builder and boomer leaders were barking up the wrong tree. Here's why. In the 1980s, American culture shifted to raising kids to be narcissistic, valued according to their performance. Christopher Lasch wrote about this in 1990, Culture of Narcissism. And if you read Rod Dreher, I read Rod Dreher pretty much every day. Dreher's been barking up this tree quite a bit himself. A culture that is narcissistic and performance-oriented eventually becomes a culture characterized by perfectionism. A narcissistic, performance-driven, perfectionist culture is one that sets up every man to be destroyed by shame of not measuring up. Okay. Millennials and Gen Z men are raised in churches speaking to them as if they were 1960s men instead of 1990s men. Yeah, I think that's true. Since shame is on average the root of all kinds of millennial and Gen Z sins, conservative churches metastasize the shame men walk into church already carrying. I think there's a lot of truth to that. This is what Jordan Peterson understands. As an observant Jungian, he knows that 28 years of shaming men needs the antidote of empathy, encouragement, and practical day-to-day ideas to help men recover their identities. Moore predicted this in 1990. Where was everyone? I'm not sure he's got Peterson right here. Certainly Peterson is a Jungian. Certainly Peterson is wading in with these archetypal categories, or at least the language of masculinity and femininity, the masculine and the feminine. But I don't know that this is, first of all, again, there's not a single variant going on here. There's got to be multiple streams. Secondly, I think Peterson is addressing this, as all my videos are saying, at a far deeper level. Peterson is definitely talking to men in a way that is connecting with men, and in a way that, men need attention. Women have been getting a lot of attention. I think a lot of it good and important and helpful. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Men certainly need something, and I think a lot of Peterson's ideas about men have a lot that's right to it. But this isn't what Bradley is talking about. It's almost as if Bradley was saying, well, if we just kind of talk to men a certain way, then men would be in churches. But the exodus from churches is far broader, and it's, I think, for the, again, not a single reason or cause for this. I think a bigger cause is the unbelievability of Christianity that has been going on in the West for a very long time now. And when Peterson goes all the way back to Nietzsche, he is getting in at the core better. And so Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, and this is far deeper than masculinity and femininity. And I think, in a sense, to locate Peterson in only this part of the conversation does a disservice to Peterson, even though I think Bradley has some points here. In the early 2000s, John Eldridge tried his best to address this shaming, but failed because he focused too much on the father and not enough on the Oedipus issues with men's mothers, and reduced masculinity to living in a Colorado, being within the woods. I thought that was a great tweet. Dude! All right, the big Lebowski. The Young Reformed and Restless movement was terrible for this. Taking in cue for shaming boomer pastors, many new Calvinists shamed guys for not being good, for not having good theology, playing video games, being single, porn, etc., with zero empathy for their already shame. Lots of rebuke with no compassion. Yeah, I think there's some of that. I think, though, the young Calvinist, the young Reformed and Restless movement did energize men in similar ways to what Peterson does, because it gave men responsibility and it encouraged men to step up in the home, and it encouraged men to not take a backseat to women. One of the things I picked up from Dreer was a newsletter that's out called the Masculinist. And if you Google it, or if you look in Dreer's archives, you can find reference to it. And Aaron Renn makes the point of why Christianity is more feminine and less masculine than, let's say, Judaism and Islam. And I think he writes quite persuasively on this. And so, I picked up this newsletter and I talked about it in some of my online forums. And I remember quite a bit of pushback from some of the women. Even the title kind of scared them. And this obviously many women that I talk to within the Christian Reformed Church. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Christian Reformed Church, the Christian Reformed Church has fought for 50 years about the role of women in office in the church. That's a very complex conversation. And I'm not going to get into it in this point because, well, the Christian Reformed Church arrived at a political truce, basically opening all offices to women. And I've always supported that. But the Christian Reformed Church has always also maintained that both theological positions are permissible and justifiable in terms of the Bible. And so in that sense, the Christian Reformed Church never settled the dispute, and in some ways the Christian Reformed Church capped the dispute, and a lot of the increasing tensions over this that the culture war irritates doesn't let this thing rest. But Aaron Renn, I think, is trying to take on some of these things, and he's someone who has followed Tim Keller in New York City. He's an urban planner, writes some really interesting stuff, and I've appreciated the stuff in his newsletter. So I don't think Anthony Bradley, while I think he has a point, the young Restless and Reformed movement didn't fully engage these issues. I don't think they made them worse. I think they didn't fully engage them, and I think some young men were helped by this movement. Acts 29 and Acts 29-ish Gen Xers and millennial leaders have gave a valiant effort, but many of those churches, like Seattle and St. Louis, were just as shaming as the culture at large. Real preaching is to make people, especially guys, feel like shit for being guys that they are. Yeah, I'd really love to have a longer conversation with Anthony Bradley about this. I don't know enough about him, and right now, since I'm doing the deep dive on Peterson, I don't have enough time to study him. I don't know that I have enough interest in this, although he's very interesting to me. I looked up some of the stuff that he's written before. He works for the Acton Institute, which is a very interesting organization in Grand Rapids, if I've got the right one. So, yeah, I don't know. Then dudes are told, A, to stop wasting your lives because they are pathetic losers. Peterson says that a lot. B, underclass men are told that they live their lives were pathetic examples of idol factories that needed to be destroyed. No empathy, no encouragement, just rebuke. Peterson does a lot of rebuking, but in an encouraging way. And I think in that way, Peterson's balance is a little bit better than some of the voices coming out of the young Restless and Reformed movement. But I wouldn't dismiss young Restless and Reformed in that way quite so quickly. Jordan Peterson then, as dad and pastor to thousands of millennials and Gen Z men, and a lot of older men too, frankly I'm finding in the buckos, needed and never had because their fathers and leaders failed to see that perfectionistic, performance-driven, failure-avoiding shame is causing men to check out of church and school for vice. Some of that, I think there are a lot of reasons men are checking out of school and work for vice. And I think Peterson addresses these issues better. But again, I'm not willing to write off the young Restless and Reformed movement, even though I myself am not a part of it. And I've got some critiques of where they took Calvinism. But, from what I've seen, knowing a certain number of young, restless, and reformed men for whom that reshaped their world, that movement really helped them live out. It helped them sort out their lives and help them sort out things. And I know for a lot of women who are complementarians, now I'm getting into weeds into Reformed intramural conversations. For a lot of complementarian women, they did not like this movement because a lot of men decided they were going, for a lot of egalitarian women, they did not like this movement because a lot of men turned to some pretty complementarian ideas. And I know a lot of my women friends aren't going to like what I say here, but I've seen that really help a lot of marriages amongst complementarians. And I don't think men would have stayed in the young, restless, and reformed movement if it in fact wasn't working for them. And it's working for them in some of the ways that Jordan Peterson is working for secular men, as I'm seeing. And at least the young, restless, and reformed movement, those men didn't become, MGTOW. They didn't leave. They didn't walk away from women. They engaged women, and they held to their principles. And I've seen a fair number of women who began as egalitarian kind of adopt a complementarian posture and found that it worked for them in their lives. So maybe I'm a little too pragmatic for some of my egalitarian Christian Reformed women friends, but I'm going to be honest with you. That's what I've seen. So I'm not ready to agree with Bradley so much in his critique of the young, restless, and reformed, even though I've got other critiques of it. And I think people checked out of churches for far bigger reasons and far more reasons than this. Until today's parents, leaders, and pastors abandon the idea that making guys feel like shit opens them up to the gospel, guys will continue to withdraw from church and life and sit at home and rewatch Jordan Peterson videos on YouTube. It's your void, not his content. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but people are watching Jordan Peterson's videos for his content. And after talking with a handful of buckos in the flesh here in Sacramento and dozens of them online, no, it's content that people are following Peterson for. And it's not just the church's void. And part of this is because so many people who have not been in church are listening to Peterson. And this is where, okay, I'll agree with Bradley some too, when we say that the church is not helping these men. And for me, part of the reason that I have jumped with both feet into this is because there's been a disconnect between the church and the buckos from Peterson. And I don't think this has to be. And I'd like, I'll lay my cards on the table. I'm a pastor. All those buckos that want to come to church, I want them to find a good church. I want them to find a life-giving place where they can study the Bible and meet God. And again, my bias, I want them to believe in the resurrection. I want to find the comfort and joy that I know. And so I want the church to be ready to receive them. And so that's part of the reason I'm doing all of these videos and working through the Jordan Peterson stuff and trying to get granular with what he believes and granular with how this changes me in positive ways and my critique of it for better or for worse. So as with most fast critiques of Peterson coming out, now that his visibility has gotten so high, I think in some ways Peterson has been strapped to a status rocket and he's shooting up there and we have no idea what's going to happen, if he's going to level off on some plateau, if he's going to come crashing down, where this is all going to fall out. But most people looking at Peterson take maybe a quick view through his book. These are people with real jobs and they don't have time to sit and watch Peterson's video, and I totally get that. Yes, I have a real job and I still do find time, but I'm weird this way. So Anthony Bradley is, I think, got a fair amount right here, but not totally right. And so I don't think he has a high enough definition, high enough resolution vision of Peterson. And so his critique on this, I don't think he gets it right. And I think he shows some of his biases and some of his critiques of the other movement. And even though in many ways, I think he makes a lot of good points here. And I'm just making this video because a number of people have pointed this to me and I wanted to respond, and I want to respond in this way instead of writing a blog post. So bottom line, okay, No empathy for men's already shame. And I completely agree with Bradley that the church has used guilt and shame against men to try to get them to comply. Churches have often, not always, hopefully not always, but have often used guilt and shame. And in my opinion, the gospel is something that releases us from that. And so myself as a pastor, I'm not a big guilter. Sometimes that makes me a little weak on accountability, which I recognize, but I won't use guilt. You're finally going to have to clean up your own room, and I'm not going to be your nanny. So not your nanny to clean up your room, and not your nanny to scold you to clean up your room. Peterson does a little bit more of that than I do. So I think Bradley gets some of this right. So yes, too much guilt and shame in the church. No encouragement. Not enough encouragement in the church. Not enough practical day-to-day regular solutions. And I think Peterson is offering some good practical wisdom in a lot of different ways. No dudes in your institution. Part of the problem has been, though, there's not only no dudes, there's also not a lot of women. And I can find a lot of posts by a lot of women who are giving similar critiques of why young women aren't in church. And this is why I think some of the larger reasons are these bigger philosophical, cultural worldview issues that I am dealing with in my videos, rather than this specific case that Anthony Bradley is pointing to. Moore, 1990, Peterson, 2018. When will leaders listen? Rebuke must follow deep empathy and encouragement about men's already shame. Now here's the double-edged sword about rebuke. We have how many Twitter posts? We have 18 Twitter posts rebuking. Will it work? No, rebuke tends to make people defensive. And some YouTube commenters have made the comment, Paul, you're a little nice to people, and we don't know if we like that. Well, people who know me in real life know that I'm sometimes not real nice. I'm trying to encourage. And then Peterson, one of the things that stuck in my mind, it's the father's job to encourage. So yeah, I'm trying to encourage. So Anthony Bradley, I liked some of what you said. I think you get some things right. I think you're being harsh in some of these other things. And I think if I'm to follow your logic, you're going to have to do something then other than shame evangelicals or shame the young, restless, and reformed movement if you want to encourage them to listen to Jordan Peterson and learn what they can from him and Jung. And I said some things in a couple of videos ago about the little group of Jungians that have been knocking on my comment section and sending me messages. And fair enough. Use your what influence you have to try to sway me. That's absolutely fine. I do the same thing with everyone else. And I've my understanding of Jung is very, very shallow. From what I've read so far, I've got questions, but I'm going to continue to try to sort out Jung and what I think about him. But that's in terms of my overall priorities. I'm reading more C.S. Lewis. I'm doing a lot more Jordan Peterson. I'm spending a lot more time on the philosophical end than I am on the Jungian end. But hopefully this is just an area of my education that needs to be brought up to speed, and I'll get there. So I don't know what Anthony Bradley thinks about Jung. I'd actually be more interested in hearing about that. So I'll attach this. Chances are good Bradley won't sit and listen to the whole thing because I don't have that status. And that's kind of how status and hierarchies work. And I accept that, but I do know that some CRC people who sent this tweet to me will probably watch this video, and so this one is for you. And the buckos will probably only watch 3 minutes and say it's not for me and go to something else, because that's the way YouTube works. So there it is.